right? So today, we are going to discuss on LKAS 36, that is impairment of assets, right? So before moving ahead, tell me what you feel with this term impairment. Is it something positive or is it something negative? So here we are discussing on impairment of assets, right? So is it discuss something related to increase the value of an asset, or something related to decrease the value of an asset? One aspect එකෙන්ද මේ කතා කරන්නේ ඇති impairment කිව්වට පස්සේ what comes to your mind? Is it something positive or something negative? But මොකක් ගැනද මේ කතා කරන්න ඇත්තේ? Impairment of assets. Is it about increasing the value of asset, or is it about decreasing the value of an asset? Right? If you are not going to answer, I will ask by name. මොකක්ද මේ කතා කරන්නේ? 0043 impairment කිව්වට පස්සේ මොකක්ද? Is it something positive or something negative? 50-50. මොකක්ද? Impairment of assets. What? It is associated with the what? Impairment of assets. No, it is not something positive. Impairment loss කියලා අපිට කලින් අහවෙලා තියෙනවනේ. ඒ මොකද්ද? හානි කරන අලාභ. right? අලාභයක් වුණාට පස්සේ මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ asset වල value එකට? asset වල value එක වැඩි වෙනවද අඩු වෙනවද? අඩු වෙනවා. So we are here in this standard, we are dealing with the reduction of the value of assets, right? That is what the term impairment means, right? Impairment of assets. It means the value of the asset is decreasing, right? So with that, we have here the learning objective. So at the end of this, what you are supposed to know, right? What you're supposed to achieve. Point number 1, what? Explain the purpose of impairment test for assets, right? ඇයි මෙහෙම ස්ටෑන්ඩඩ් එකක් තියෙන්නේ? ඇයි අපි assets වලට අදාළව impairment testings කරන්න ඕන? right? Impairment loss එකක් තියෙනවා නම් ඇයි අපි ඒව accounts වලට අරන් එන්න ඕන? That aspect we are going to discuss. Point number 2, assess when to undertake an impairment test, right? For each and every asset, we are not going to take impairment tests, right? Screen එකේ දියන් දෙන්න එපා. Can I do? Right? So for each and every asset, we are not going to undertake impairment test. If there are impairment indications only, we supposed to do impairment test. So we will discuss separately what are impairment indications, what are impairment tests, how to recognize these things we will cover, right? Point number 3, explain how to undertake an impairment test and account for an individual asset, right? How to do this test? මේ impairment test කියන එක කොහොමද අපි කරන්නේ? And point number 4, the same thing with respect to a cash generating unit. එහෙනම් impairment test කියන එක, so we can do it for individual assets as well as for cash generating units, right? Account for reversal of impairment losses, right? When there is a reversal, how can we account for that? And the disclosure requirements. So these are the things we are going to discuss under LKAS 36, right? So the objective of the standard, what it says, the objective of the standards is to prescribe the procedures that an entity applies to ensure that its assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount, right? Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. That is where I need your focus. When me red font again දීලා තියෙන්නේ මෙතනටයි මට ඔයාලගේ අවධානය ඕන, right? Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. This standard, this is the core of this standard. Standard taking ensure කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ මෙන්න මේ දේ. right? මේ මොකක්ද කියලා so I will discuss. Okay? Right. Then impairment requires the carrying amount of an asset to be reduced to its recoverable amount. Right? And carrying amount, so the carrying amount we know. How to take carrying amount? Cost minus accumulated depreciation. Right? And so here impairment requires the carrying amount of an asset to be reduced to its recoverable amount. How to do that we will discuss. Right? The reduction is treated as the impairment loss. So this is the objective of the standard. Right? If we take a balance sheet, so we have assets, right? We have assets. Assets කියන එක තමයි ලියුවේ. Right? We have assets. Think for an example, there is a asset, there's a machine, right? Machine worth of 1,000. අපේ balance sheet එකේ පෙන්නනවා machine කියලා 1,000 rupees. So what is this 1,000 rupees? මෙන්න මේ 1,000 rupees, how it has arrived? මේ 1,000 rupees ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ කොහොමද? How we have arrived to this 1,000 rupees? කොහොමද මේ 1,000 rupees වලට අපි මේ balance sheet එකේ මෙදා පෙන්නන්නේ? Assume we prepare this on 31st March 2021. Right, as at this balance sheet date, it shows as a asset called machine worth of 1,000. So my question is, how can we arrive for this value? මේ 1,000 කියන එක මෙතනට ඇවිල්ලා ඇත්තේ කොහොමද? කවදා හරි අපි machine එකක් කීයක් හරි දීලා ගන්න ඇති. ගත්ත දවසේ ඉඳන් අපි මේක depreciate කරන් එන්න ඇති. ආවට පස්සේ මෙන්න මෙදාට value එක 1000ක් විදියට ඉතුරු වෙලා පෙන්නනවා. Or else what is this? Cost එකෙන් accumulated depreciation අඩු වුණාට පස්සේ තියෙන මොන amount එකද මේ? This is the carrying amount. Right? This is the carrying amount. So here the requirement of this asset of this standard is what? Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. It means there is something we need to calculate separately called recoverable amount. Right? Recoverable amount. I denote it as RA. Assume the recoverable amount of this asset is 800. Right? Recoverable amount is 800. Make up calculate right? So how to calculate we will discuss. So for the moment you assume the recoverable amount is 800. Right? Recoverable amount කියලා කියන්නේ සාමාන්‍යයෙන් දැන් මේ machine එක අපි මෙන්න මෙදා market එකේ ගිහිල්ලා විකුණනවා නම් අපිට 1000ට විකුණ ගන්න බෑ. අපිට විකුණ ගන්න පුළුවන් උපරිම value එක 800. That is the simple understanding, right? The maximum value that we can sell this machine on this date at the market is at this price, at 800. So we cannot gain more than that. මේ machine එකට අපිට මීට වඩා මිලක් market එකෙන් ගන්න බෑ. That is the simple meaning of recoverable amount, right? So this is the amount that we can sell this machine in the market. So what you can observe here? What? Machine කියලා අපේ පොත්වල තියෙනවා 1000ක්. හැබැයි අපිට ඕක ඇත්තටම market එකේ විකුණ ගන්න පුළුවන් කීයටද? 800කට විතරයි. Recoverable amount එක 800යි. So this standard needs to ensure what? Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. Recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩියෙන් assets අපිට පොත්වල අඳුන ගන්න බෑ. මෙයාට වඩා රුපියලක්වත් වැඩියෙන් අපිට පොත්වල ඔය කියන asset එක අඳුන ගන්න බෑ. In order to ensure that this particular standard is there. Clear? එහෙනම් machine කියලා අපිට balance sheet එකේ අඳුන ගන්න පුළුවන් කීයක් විතරද? What is the amount that we can recognize here in our balance sheet? What? In this case, it should be not 1,000, it should be 800. So in order to do this thing, instead of identifying the value of the machine as 1000, we now need to identify it as 800. So what is the double entry we need to pass? මේ 1800 කරගන්න මම පාස් කරන්න ඕන ඩබල් එන්ට්‍රි මොකද්ද? මැෂින් කියන ඇසෙට් එකේ වැලියු එක කොහොමත් මොකක් වෙනවද මේ? අඩු වෙනවා. අඩු වෙද්දි මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ?
Loss.
Yes. Right? So this is the machine account. So we have 1000 rupees here. Now we cannot take it as 1000 anymore. ඉස්සරහට අපිට දැන් 1000 කියලා යන්න බෑ. Right? It should be 800. එහෙනම් 800 කරන්න මොකද කරන්න ඕනේ? We need to credit 200 rupees to our machine කියන asset account එකට. Right? We need to credit 200. So where should be the debit entry here? මෙයාගේ debit entry යන්න ඕන කොහාටද? Debit entry යන්න ඕන කොහාටද? That should goes to P&L. As what? P&L එකේ debit entry යන්නේ as what? As impairment loss. Right? Impairment loss. So that is the objective. So that is what we are going to do, right, under LKAS 36. Right? This is the requirement of LKAS 36. Assume the recoverable amount is not 800. It is 1500. Scenario 1 එකේදී මම තමයි මම කිව්වේ recoverable amount එක 800 කියලා. එතකොට එහෙම වුණොත් අපිට 1000ට පෙන්වන්න බෑ. අපිට 800ට පෙන්වන්න වෙන්නේ. 800ට පෙන්වන්න නම් this entry we need to pass. 200 rupees we need to debit it to P&L as impairment loss and credit to the asset account. So assume it is not 800, the recoverable amount is 1500. Now what happens? Now what happens? අපි 1000ට අපේ carrying amount එක 1000, right? That is what appears here at the moment. And then since maybe there may be impairment indications, we have done an impairment test and we found the recoverable amount, or we can sell this machine at the market at this price, 1500. So now what would be your approach? දැන් මොකද්ද කරන්නේ?
Machine debit.
Machine debit, yes.
500. Credit to P&L. 500 rupees.
No, right? That is the incorrect approach. අපි එහෙම කරොත් වැරදි. අපි මෙතන ඇත්තම requirement එක මොකද්ද? Right? What is the objective? I need you to carefully read this. Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. Recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩියෙන් මෙතන පෙන්වන්න බෑ. Balance sheet එකේ පෙන්වන්න බෑ. දැන් අපි කීයද පෙන්වන්නේ? Right? 1000 rupees තමයි මේ පෙන්නගෙන ඉන්නේ. Carrying amount එක. Recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩි amount එකක් පෙන්වන්න බෑ කියන එක තමයි requirement එක. අපේ recoverable amount එක කීයද? 1500. අපි ඊට වඩා වැඩි amount එකක් පෙන්නනවද?
No.
No. Therefore, we do not need to pass in double entry. එහෙමනම් අපි මුකුත් double entry එකක් pass කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. Right? So we are dealing with this objective. This is the objective. Assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. If so, if the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, if this is greater than the recoverable amount, then only, right, we need to treat for the impairment loss. අපි impairment profit කියලා මුකුත් අඳුන ගන්න නැහැ. Impairment කියන වචනේම තියෙනවනේ. It's something negative, something to decrease the value of the asset. So we are not dealing with the other side, right? If there is a decrease of the asset only, right? If our carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount only, we pass the double entry. Clear? Right? So that is the whole purpose of this standard, right? LKAS 36. Right, scope. So here what it says, applicable to all assets other than the following. මෙන්න මේ කියන ඒවට අමතරව අනිත් හැම asset එකකටම මේක අදාළයි. Right? We need to apply. It is not applicable for inventories because there's a separate standard LKAS 2. LKAS 2 වල මොකක්ද කියන requirement එක? Right? මොකක්ද? Lower than the cost of net realizable value. When we need to, right, value the inventories, we need to go for the lower one, cost of net realizable value. එතකොට ඒකේ deal කරන විදිය separately කියනවා, right? As well as in the other standards, right? Assets arising from construction contracts, deferred tax assets, assets arising from employee benefits, financial assets, investment property valued at fair value, right? Biological assets, and right, deferred acquisition cost and intangible assets arising from an insurance contractual rights under insurance contracts, NCA, non-current assets held for sale. So for these particular assets, right, we do not apply LKS 36. මෙන්න මේවට අපි LKS 36 ඔය recoverable amount කතා කරලා impairment loss එක අඳුනගෙන ඒව count කරන්න යන්නේ නැහැ. මෙන්න මේ asset වලට අදාළව. So then for what kind of assets we apply this standard? මෙන්න මේ assets වලට අදාළව අපිට අඳුන ගන්න බෑලු, apply කරන්න බෑලු. එහෙනම් මොන assets වලට අදාළවද අපිට LKS 36 apply කරන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ? For what kind of assets can we apply this LKS 36 standard or impairment of assets standard? මෙතන නැති කවුද? මෙතන නැති ලොකු එක්කෙනා කවුද? assets ගැන කතා කරද්දි what?
LKS class.
Yes, LKS 16, property, plant and equipment. So what kind of assets are coming under property, plant and equipment? PPE කියන්නේ මොන වගේ assets ද? Right? What? Machineries, furniture and fittings, buildings, land, right? Office equipments. So for those assets, this is applicable. LKS 36. Right. So what is an asset impairment? An asset is impaired when an entity will not be able to recover its carrying amount through using or selling. Right? So simply what? If the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, then we identify a impairment loss. අපේ පොත්වල පෙන්වන carrying amount එකට වඩා ධාරණාගයට වඩා වැඩි මිලකට අපිට ඒ ධාරණ මිලට හෝ ඊට වඩා වැඩි මිලකට අපේ ඔය කියන asset එක අපිට market එකේ විකුණ ගන්න බැරි නම් නැත්නම් අපිට ඒක පාවිච්චි කරලා benefit එකක් ගන්න බැරි නම්, right, then we say what? There is an impairment loss. Right? There is an impairment loss. So recovery here, what it says, recovery can be from disposal of the asset or from future use of the asset. And recovery කියන එක, so we call the recoverable amount. එතකොට ඔය recover කරගන්න පුළුවන් amount එක කියනකොට it can take two aspects. Right? It can take two aspects or two ways. Right? One is what? Either we can use it. අපිට ඕක continuously use කරන්න පුළුවන්. machine එකක් නම් අපිට තව අවුරුදු 5ක් නම් ඒ අවුරුදු ඉස්සර අවුරුදු 5කට ඕක use කරන්න පුළුවන්. We can continuously use that asset. Or else, what is the other option we have? We can sell it immediately. අපිට ඕක විකුණලා ඒකෙන් අපිට cash benefit එකක් ගන්න පුළුවන්. Right? So from both of those two ways, we can recover the amount. So when determining that recoverable amount, we need to take into account both of those two ways. Right? Man recoverable amount කියලා නිකන් amount එකක් දාලා පෙන්නන ඕනේ. ඔය amount එක ගද්දී අපි දැනගන්න ඕන මොකද්ද? අපිට recover කරගන්න පුළුවන් approach දෙකක් තියෙනවා. එකක් අපිට ඔය කියන asset එක දිගින් දිගටම පාවිච්චි කරලා ඒකේ value එක අපිට recover කරගන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙමත් නැත්නම් ඔය කියන asset එක market එකේ විකුණලා අපිට ඒකේ අදාළ වටිනාකම recover කරගන්න පුළුවන්. එහෙනම් recoverable amount එක calculate කරද්දී we need to consider both of those two approaches. Right? So we'll discuss that separately. Then, when to undertake an impairment test? Do we need to undertake impairment test annually? for each and every asset. When to undertake? But it says assess at each reporting date, including interim date, whether there is any indication that asset may be impaired, right? And second bullet point, aim at this stage is not to perform the impairment test, but to identify whether there are indications which warrant any impairment test. If indicators exist, management is required to perform the impairment test, right? For each and every asset, we are not going to perform impairment test, right? අපේ balance sheet එකේ තියෙන හැම asset එකකටම නැත්නම් මේ standard එක apply වෙන හැම asset එකකටම අපි මොකක් කරන්න යන්නේ නැද්ද? Impairment test එක කරන්න යන්නේ නැහැ. What do you mean by doing the impairment test? It is simply what? Calculating the recoverable amount, right? Recoverable amount එක cal කරන එක තමයි මේ impairment test එක කියලා කියන්නේ, right? So we are not going to calculate the recoverable amount for each and every asset in our balance sheet or for the assets which this standard is applied, which can be applied, right? මේ standard එක apply වෙන හැම asset එකකම අපි impairment test එක කරන්න යන්නේ නැහැ. If there are indications, impairment indications only, then we need to perform the impairment test, right? Impairment indications තියෙනවා නම් විතරයි ඒ asset එකට අදාළව අපි impairment test එක කරන්නේ. For an example, assume there are 5 assets A, B, C, D, and E, right? A, B, C, those 3 assets do not show any impairment indication. ඔය A, B, C කියන asset තුනේ මුකුත්ම impairment indication එකක් පෙන්වන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ asset එක impair වෙලා කියලා, right? මුකුත් indication එකක් නැහැ. Therefore, for those 3 assets, we do not need to do impairment testing, or we do not need to calculate the recoverable amount separately. If assets D and E shows impairment indications, then for those 2 assets only, we need to do the impairment test, right? So the key output here in this slide is what? If there is an impairment indication only, you need to perform the impairment test. No need otherwise. නැත්තම් ඕනේ නැහැ. Right. Saying that, again, there are exceptions. What? The following assets must be tested for impairment annually, irrespective of existence of any impairment indicators. In the previous slide, I told what? If there are impairment indications only, impairment indications තියෙනවා නම් විතරයි, right? What are these impairment indications? We will discuss, right? So if there are impairment indications only, we need to perform the impairment test. But there are exceptions. For these 3 types of assets, irrespective of whether there are any impairment indications or not, we need to perform the impairment test annually. මෙන්න මේ asset categories තුනට, right? What? Intangibles with indefinite useful lives, right? Intangible assets, there is another separate standard, LKAS 38. So we have to discuss that as well, right? So if there are intangibles with indefinite useful lives, right? Or if there are intangibles not yet available for use, or goodwill acquired in a business combination, business, this one you may have came across, right? Goodwill. අපි business combination එකේදී goodwill එක පොත් වලට අරන් එනවා. එහෙනම් goodwill is also an intangible asset, right? That one, goodwill, annually we need to assess whether the value of this goodwill has been impaired or not, right? So for these 3 types of assets, what we need to do, irrespective of whether there are impairment indications or not, impairment indications තිබ්බත් නැතත් මෙන්න මේ assets වලට අදාළව we need to do what? Impairment testing, or we need to calculate the recoverable amount annually, right? Now we come to indicators of impairment, right? Impairment indications තියෙනවා නම් විතරයි අපි impairment test එක කරන්නේ. So what are these impairment indications? So these indicators can come from external sources as well as from internal sources, right? External sources වලින් අපිට මේ indications කියන්නේ දර්ශකනේ අපිට මොකක්ද signal එකක් දෙනවා කියන එකනේ, right? It external sources වලින් මේ signal එක දෙන්න පුළුවන්, right? The red signal, right? Or else the signals can be provided by internal sources. So first we will discuss few examples coming under external sources. Decline in market value may be decrease in value due to a better technologically improved asset is there in the market, right? අපි දැනට පාවිච්චි කරන asset එකට වඩා technologically advanced asset එකක් market එකට ආවොත් automatically මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ? අපේ දැන් තියෙන asset එකේ යගේ මොකක් වෙනවද? The value of the asset is decreased, අඩු වෙනවා, right? Therefore what? It is an indication. එතකොට ඒකෙන් අපිට indication එකක් දෙනවා මොකද්ද? අපේ මෙන්න මේ asset එකට අදාළ recoverable amount එක carrying amount එකට වඩා අඩු ඇති. අඩුයි කියලා නෙවෙයි, අඩු ඇති කියලා, right? It is a signal. So for this particular asset, our carrying amount may be higher than the recoverable amount. That indication, that signal is provided through this source. Oh, second bullet point, adverse changes in entity's environment or market. Example, competitor may have patented a new product. අපි competitor දෙන්නම එකම product එක මොකක් හරි product එකක් මොකක් නැත්නම් asset එකක් තියෙනවා, competitor ගිහිල්ලා ඒකට patent එකක් ගන්න. එතකොට අපේ එකේ value එක මොකක්ද? ගොඩක් වෙලාවට අඩු වෙන්න තියෙන ඉඩ වැඩි, right? Or resulting in a permanent fall in market share of the entity, right? So those are the indicators, right? Increases in interest rates. This affects the present value of future cash flows. Increases in interest rates. Only අනුපාතය වැඩි වෙද්දි මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ? Right? So here I told you, when determining the recoverable amount, we have two approaches. Either we can use it or we can sell it. If we are using it, what supposed to generate, right? So we can, if we are going to use it for another 5 years, so we should able to identify the future cash inflows and outflows of that asset. So those inflows and outflows, we need to consider the present value of those, right? Future cash inflows and outflows. Cash inflows, outflows වල අවුරුදු පහේ අපි මොකක් අඳුන ගන්න ඕනද? present value එක අඳුන ගන්න ඕන. එතකොට present value එක අඳුන ගනිද්දී මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ? Increases in interest rate. පොලි අනුපාත වැඩි වුණොත්, right? Present value එක කැල් කරද්දී අපිට මොකක්ද ඕන වෙන්නේ? Discounted factor. If we are using an increased discount factor of WACC, weighted average cost of capital, අපි 10% නෙවෙයි 15% වලට යනම නම් what will happen, right? Then the present value will decrease. Present value of future cash flows will be decreased. So that is also an indications. When making sums, you will understand these points, right? And carrying amount of net assets is higher than its market capitalization. අපේ balance sheet එකේ equity component යටතේ පෙන්නන total equity value එක market capitalization එකට වඩා මොකක් නන්ද, right? Market capitalization එකට වඩා වැඩි නම් it is also a impairment indication, right? So we always need to look for these impairment indications. අපි හැමතිස්සෙම මේ indications දිහා බල ඉන්න ඕන. අපේ මේ පෙන්නන value එකට වඩා ඇත්තටම market එකේ value එක අඩුයිද, right? We need to assess. Assess කරන්නේ, right, based on these indications. So those are few examples for external sources. And there are internal sources as well, right? Obsolescence or physical damage. When we are using assets, so the assets can be physically damaged. So that is an indication where, so we may not able to sell this at the carrying amount. We may have to sold this particular asset for a value below the carrying amount. Damage වුණාට පස්සේ අපිට, right, පෙන්නන carrying amount එකට විකුණ ගන්න බැරි වෙයි කියලා it gives an signal, indication, right? Change in asset use. Has the asset become idle? Change in asset use. Has the asset become idle? Right? So it is an indication. It is also an indication. Right? So For an example, if we have 3 assets, A, B, and C, right? If we are using assets B and C regularly and kind of a ignorance on the asset A අපි වැඩි පාවිච්චි කරන්නේ නැත්නම්, right? It will become idle. So becoming idle, asset becoming idle is also an impairment indication, right? And the economic performance of the asset, it may be in 2 ways. What? Cash outflows are higher than expected. Machine එකක් නම් අපිට අපි මේක machine එක අවුරුදු 5ක් අපි පාවිච්චි කරන්න expect කරනවා, right? So we have a certain expected amount on the maintenance cost at for particular year. This will be the maintenance cost that we may have to incur, right? But that can be, right, that can be changed in reassessing, right? අපි machine එකක් ගාලා පාවිච්චි කරද්දී it will break down regularly. ඒක හැමතිස්සම අපේ printer එක වගේ, right? අනිවාර්යෙන් සති දෙකකට සැරයක් යනවා maintenance වලට, right? So that is also an indication. එතකොට maintenance වැඩි වෙනවා කියලා කියන්නේ අපේ cash outflow එක වැඩි වෙනවා. අපි expect කර ප්‍රමාණයට වඩා cash outflows වැඩි වෙනවා නම්, right, that is also an impairment indications. Or else if our cash inflows are lower than expected, right? අපේ cash inflows අපි expect කරපු ප්‍රමාණයට වඩා අඩුවෙන් නම් generate වෙන්නේ. It is also an, right, impairment indications. So impairment indications can be from these two sources, right? It can be either from internal sources or it can be from external sources. So we need to keep our eye on these indicators, right? So now we comes to the impairment test, right? Impairment, again I'm going to the point I have raised earlier. If there are impairment indications only, we need to perform the impairment test. So by identifying impairment indications, now we have determined for which assets we need to do the impairment testing. So now we come to the impairment testing part, right, for an individual asset. Okay, so here doing impairment testing means what? We need to calculate what? Recoverable amount. Impairment testing එක කරනවා කියලා කියන්නේ අපි recoverable amount එක අඳුන ගන්න ඕන, right? We need to identify the recoverable amount. So what is recoverable amount? asset එකක් අපිට recover කරගන්න තියෙන approach දෙක මොකක්ද? එකක් මොකක්ද? Either we can use it continuously for the expected period of time, or what? We can sell it immediately in the market. So this is those two. මේ තියෙන්නේ තේ දෙකම තමයි. If we are going to use it for the expected number of years or throughout its useful life, right, the value we can extract from that is value in use, right? Value in use. Or if we are going to sell it immediately in the market, so the value we can get as the recoverable amount is what? Fair value less cost to sell, right? So when determining the recoverable amount, we need to consider what value? Whichever is the higher. මෙන්න මේ දෙකෙන් වඩා වැඩි යකය මොකක්ද? That should be our what? Recoverable amount, right? Whichever the higher. If this is 1000 and if this value is 1500, what is the higher value? 1500. So that is our what then? Recoverable amount, 1500, right? So this recoverable amount, this 1500, then we need to compare with what? The carrying amount. අපේ ධාරණගයත් එක්ක. How to determine carrying amount? You know this. How? Cost minus accumulated depreciation, right? ඒකත් එක්කයි recoverable amount එක compare වෙන්න ඕන. If the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, අපේ පොත්වල පෙන්නන අගය අර recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩි නම්, right, ඒක එහෙම වෙන්න බෑ. So this standard is to ensure what? The assets are carried at no more than their recoverable amount. Recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩියෙන් assets පොත්වල අඳුනගන්න බෑ. That is the requirement. That is why this standard is there. Therefore, what we need to do? We need to identify the impairment loss. If it is otherwise, if the recoverable amount is greater than the carrying amount, what? We do not need to take any further action, right? Recoverable amount එක වැඩි නම් අපේ පොත්වල පෙන්නන අගයට වඩා carrying amount එකට වඩා, right? Then we need not to bother, right? No further action is required. Are you clear with this one? How to determine the recoverable amount? So recoverable amount එක determine කරද්දී, right? We need to consider both of these values. Fair value less cost to sell value එක දැනගන්නත් ඕන, value in use එක දැනගන්නත් ඕන. එතකොට මේ දෙකෙන් වඩා වැඩි අගය මොකක්ද? That is our recoverable amount, right? Then impairment test for an individual asset. So here what it says, the previous diagram shows there are two possible amounts against which the carrying amount can be tested for impairment. Carrying amount එක recoverable amount එක අපි compare කරන්න ඕන in order to identify the impairment loss. So in determining the recoverable amount, we came across with two values. One is fair value less cost of disposal, or we say fair value less cost to sell, right? FVLCS, fair value less, LESS less cost to sell, or value in use, VIU. Not always necessary to measure both amounts when testing for impairment. This is important, right? We need not always to measure both these amounts when testing for impairment. Impairment testing එක කරද්දී මේ values දෙකම අපිට සාමාන්‍ය මේ දෙකම ඕන. හැබැයි මේ දෙකම කැල් කරන්න ඕන නැති අවස්ථාවක් තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. What it says? If either one of these two amounts is higher than the carrying amount, the asset is not impaired. Assume right? I cannot write it here. Right? Assume the carrying amount is 1000. I'm taking the same figure. Right? Carrying amount එක 1000. Recoverable amount එක determine කරන්න නම් අපි දැනගන්න ඕන values දෙක මොකක්ද? We should know fair value less cost to sell, right? Fair value less cost to sell, as well as the value in use figure. මේ figures දෙකම අපි වෙන වෙනම calculate කරලා ගන්න ඕන, determine කරන්න ඕන. Assume first we determine the fair value less cost to sell. Assume this value is 1200. 1200, right? So now my question is, do we need to calculate this? Right? ඔතනට එන්න කලින් අපි මෙහෙම කියමු. Fair value less cost to sell is 800. මේ කීරියෙන් දින මම දන්නේ නැහැ මේක නවත්තන්නේ කොහොමද කියලා. Right? Fair value less cost to sell. මෙන්න මේ value එක you assume it is 800. Right? 1200 කතන්දරය අමතක කරන්න පොඩ්ඩකට. This is 800. Carrying amount is 1000. Now tell me, do we need to calculate value in use? Value in use cal කරන්න ඕනද? Do we need to determine this value? Yes or no?
No.
Right? Why not? ඇයි අපි මෙයා මේ value එක determine කරන්න ඕනේ නැත්තේ? අපිට recoverable amount කියලා කෙලිම මෙතනට 800 ගන්න පුළුවන් කියලාද කියන්නේ? අපිට මේ 800 කෙලිම මෙතනට ගන්න පුළුවන් කියලාද කියන්නේ? Is it what you mean?
Yes.
Right? So recoverable amount means what here? Recoverable amount means what? Equal to the what? Higher of fair value less cost to sell and value in use. මේ value දෙකෙන් මොනාගේද වඩා වැඩි අගය, right? Whichever is the higher is the recoverable amount. So here when we come to this case, right, 800 is the fair value less cost to sell. If this is 900, what will happen? මෙයා 900 වුණා නම් මොකද්ද වෙන්නේ? අපේ recoverable amount එක තවදුරටත් 800ද? නෑ. කීයද? මේ දෙකෙන් වඩා වැඩි අගය තමයි මොකක් වෙන්නේද? අපේ recoverable amount එක වෙන්නේ. If this is 900, then the higher amount is this 900. So that should be our what? Recoverable amount. Right? Clear? Whichever the higher of these two should be our recoverable amount. අපි එහෙනම් carry මොකක් හරි මේ දෙකෙන් එකක් ඉස්සෙල්ලා අපි කැල් කරනවනේ. කැල් කරද්දී අපිට එන value එක carrying amount එකට වඩා අඩුයි නම් we must calculate the other value as well. අපි අනිත් value එකත් කැල් කරන්නම ඕන. Right? That is a must. Clear? Right? So we have impairment indications. So we are going for impairment testing. Impairment testing වල අපි ඉස්සෙල්ලාම කැල් කරනවා fair value less cost to sell or value in use, one of these two. හිතන්න අපි මෙයා කැල් කරනවා කියලා ඉස්සෙල්ලාම and found that its value is lower than the carrying amount. මෙයාගේ value එක carrying amount එකට වඩා අඩුයි. Then what we need to do? We must calculate the other value as well. අපි මෙයා නම් ඉස්සෙල්ලා කැල් කරේ අනිත් value එකත් අපි කැල් කරන්නම ඕන. Then but whichever the higher is our recoverable amount, then that amount we need to compare with the carrying amount and then identify the impairment loss. Right? Second scenario, the main figures the second scenario, first you calculate again this value, fair value less cost to sell, and you found the value is 1200. Value get thus this year. Now, do you need to calculate this value? පළවෙනි scenario එකේ දුන්නේ පළවෙනි පාර කැල් කරා fair value less cost to sell, carrying amount එකට වඩා අඩු amount එකක් ආවි. ඒක නිසා අපි අනිත් එකත් කැල් කරා. Then compared and got the recoverable amount, whichever the higher. In the second case, now first we have calculated the fair value less cost to sell amount. It is 1200. Now my question is, do we need to calculate value in use? මෙයාව කැල් කරන්න ඕනද? Yes or no? Carrying amount is 1000. We have calculated the fair value less cost to sell, that is 1200. So do we need to calculate value in use? Do we need to calculate value in use? Ashen, අපි value in use එක කැල් කරන්න ඕනද? Carrying amount එක 1000යි. Fair value less cost to sell කැල් කරලා ගත්ත 1200. එහෙනම් අපි value in use කැල් කරන්න ඕනද?
කැල් කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ නේද?
Yes, we do not need to calculate. අපි මෙයාව කැල් කරන්න ඕනේ නැහැ. ඇයි? අපි recoverable amount කියලා ගන්න මේ දෙකෙන් වඩා වැඩි අගය. අපිට මේක right 800 වුණත්, right, assume this is 800, no issue. What is the amount we are considering here? Whichever the higher, 1200. 1200 තමයි අපි මෙතනට ගන්නෙ. වඩා වැඩි අගය. 1200 ගත්තත් අපිට මුකුත් වෙනවද? නෑ. ඇයි? carrying amount එක recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩි නෑ. අඩුයි. එහෙනම් අපි මොකද්ද? We do not go for any further actions. Further actions is not required. Impairment loss එකක් අඳුර ගන්න දෙයක් නෑ. Impairment loss එකක් නෑ. මෙයා 800 නෙවෙයි. මෙයා හිතන්නේ 1500 වුණා කියලා. Then what is the recoverable amount? The value of recoverable amount we need to consider, whichever the higher, 1500. මෙතෙන්ට 1500 අරන් ගියා කියලාත් මොකද්ද? Are we supposed to identify an impairment loss? No, our carrying amount is lower than the recoverable amount. Market එකේ අපිට දැන් පොත්වල පෙන්නන අගයට වඩා වැඩි මිලකට ගිහිල්ලා විකුණන්න පුළුවන්. විකුණන්න පුළුවන් නම් මොකක්ද එතන නැත්තේ? Impairment loss එකක් නැහැ. ඒක 1200 වුණත් 1500 වුණත් අපි පොත්වලට අරන් ඉන්නේ නැහැ. right? We can show the amount as it is at the carrying amount, right? Right. So hope you could understand that. Right. Impairment test. So here, how to determine the fair value less cost to sale. This concept of fair value I have, right? Fair value I have mentioned as earlier as well when we are discussing LKAS 16. What is fair value? Right? There is a separate standard on discussing how to determine these fair values, SLFRS 13. So it is what? The price that would be received to sell an asset or paid to transfer a liability in an orderly transaction between market participants at the measurement date. Mama අද මොකක් හරි machine එකක් විකුණනවා නම්, right, at set 31st March 2021 at the reporting date, if I am going to sell my machine, right, at what price I could sell it, simply that is the fair value. At what price කියලා කියද්දී එතන මොකක් වෙන්න ඕනද? It should be an orderly transaction. Again, right, close relationships තියෙන අය අතර ගනුදෙනු වෙද්දී මොකක්ද වෙන්නේ? ඒ ගනුදෙනු arms length price එකකට නෙවෙයි වෙන්නේ. අතේ දුරින් සිද්ධ වෙන ගනුදෙනුවක් නෙවෙයි. හැබැයි අපි fair value එක determine කරද්දී මොන value එකද consider කරන්න ඕන? right, අතේ දුරින් සිද්ධ වෙන, right, ගනුදෙනුවක වටිනාකම තමයි අපි consider කරන්න ඕන. Right, hope that is clear. I have explained this point earlier as well. Right, fair value. Cost to sell. right, එහෙනම් අපි ওই machine එක විකුණන්න යද්දී අපිට දඩස් ගාලා එකපාර විකුණන්න බෑ. විකුණන්න යද්දී අපිට එක එක වියදම් දරන්න වෙයි. මොන වගේ වියදම්ද? Legal fees, it may be stamp duty or transaction taxes, it may be cost of removing the asset, right? Or there can be direct incremental cost to bring the asset to the saleable condition, right? So if there are these sort of cost, we need to deduct such from the fair value when determining the fair value less cost to sell, right? Fair value less cost to sell. fair value කියලා කියන්නේ market එකේ ගිහිල්ලා විකුණන්න පුළුවන් ගාන. cost to sell කියලා කියන්නේ එහෙම විකුණන්න යද්දී අපිට දරන්න වෙන වියදම්. එහෙනම් එහෙම දරන්න වෙන වියදම් අඩු කරාට පස්සේ, right, the residual amount we identified as fair value less cost to sell. And then value in use, right? What it says, what do you mean by value in use? මේ approach එකට එන්නේ කොහමද? fair value less cost to sell කියලා කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? Immediately we sell the asset. Value in use means what? We are using the asset continuously throughout its useful life. The present value of future cash flows expected to be derived from an asset or cash generating unit. That is simply value in use. If I am going to use a particular asset for 3-year period, what are the cash inflows and outflows throughout those 3 periods? Then I need to find the present value of those cash flows, and that present value of those future cash flows, the name we given is what? Value in use. පළවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ net cash inflow එකක් තියෙනවා 1000, දෙවෙනි අවුරුද්දේ 1500, තුන්වෙනි අවුරුද්දේ again 2000, right? If we are calculating the present value of each of those cash flows, the summation of those present value of future cash flows is what we know as value in use, right? Future cash flows වල present value එකට තමයි අපි මොකක් කියන්නේද? Value in use කියලා කියන්නේ. So determining the future cash flows, projections should be based on management best estimates and most recent budgets or forecast, right? Cash inflows should include those from continuing use of the asset as well as those expected on the disposal of the asset. These things you know when calculating, right, the NPV and all. So you have came across these points, how to determine the future cash flows. Cash outflows must also be taken into account. Inflows, outflows, දෙකම අපි consider කරන්න ඕන, right? අපිට කොච්චර එකකින් benefits generate වෙනවද? මේ අර maintenance cost වලට වගේ අපිට අවුරුද්දෙන් අවුරුද්ද කීයක් යයිද? Then determine the future cash flows, right? These things you know. Management accounting wala NPV calculaddi, right? These points you have came across, so I'm not going to elaborate on this. Right. Recognition and measurement of impairment loss. An impairment loss is recognized when, now you know, when the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. We have to identify an impairment loss. Where the asset is accounted for under the cost model, the impairment loss is recognized immediately in profit or loss. Cost model, right? You know, in PPE, when it comes to subsequent measurement, we have two options. What? Either we can go for cost model or we can go for revaluation model. If we have applied the cost model impairment loss, we need to immediately identify in the profit or loss. Where the asset is accounted for under the revaluation model, right? The impairment loss is treated as a revaluation decrease. Right? Revaluation model එකට ගියොත් අපි එක revaluation decrease එකක් විදියටයි treat කරන්න ඕන. Any subsequent depreciation or amortization is based on the new recoverable amount. එතකොට අර මම මුලින්ම ගත්ත example එකේ, right? Carrying amount කියලා අපිට 1000 පෙන්වන්න බෑ. What we need to take into account is 800. Then, right, if we can use that particular asset for 5 more years, we need to divide 800 by 5, not 1000. Alut recoverable amount එකයි අපි consider කරන්නේ, right, when determining the depreciation value. Right. So here is an example. But an asset has a carrying amount of rupees 1 million. Carrying amount එක 1 million. Right? The cost is 1.6 million. It means there are accumulated depreciation worth of 0.6 million. And the recoverable amount is 900,000. Carrying amount එක දෙනවා, recoverable amount එක දෙනවා. Carrying amount එක recoverable amount එකට වඩා වැඩිද අඩුයිද? Is our carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, or is it less than the recoverable amount? What? 1 million is greater than this. Carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount. Then there is what? There is an what? Impairment loss of how much? 100,000. So the journal entry we need to pass in this case is what? Impairment loss or P&L account debit by 100,000, credited to where? Accumulated depreciation and impairment losses. Or else simply most of the time what we do, හරිම විදිය තමයි මේක. හරිම විදිය තමයි P&L එක debit වෙලා මෙන්න මේ account එකට තමයි credit වෙන්න ඕන. But in your exams, or right, for the easy use, where we credit this amount to the asset account. Right? Exam එකේ asset account කියලා ලියුවට වැඩිද දාන්නේ නැහැ. හැබැයි මේක තමයි හරිම account එක. මොකද්ද? Accumulated depreciation and impairment losses. Right? 100,000. So here it says what? We do not reverse the balance of the accumulated depreciation account. අපි ගාව දැනටමත් මොන account එකක් තියෙද? For the moment, right, we have an account called accumulated depreciation. Accumulated depreciation කියලා අපිට දැනටමත් account එකක් තියෙනවා. Accumulated depreciation කියලා. So we have this account, accumulated depreciation. Balance එක කීයක් තියෙනවද? Right? 0.6 million. ඔන්නම balance එකක් තියෙනවා. Now we are going to identify an impairment loss of 100,000. Then we are not going to totally what? Reverse this amount. Means 0.6 million reverse කරන්න යන්නේ එහෙම මොකුත් නැහැ. We only rename this account. මේ account එකම අපි rename කරනවා කොහොමද? accumulated depreciation and impairment loss කියලා. right? අපි අලුත් account එකක් ගන්න තිබ්බ account එකම තමයි මේ rename වෙන්නේ. accumulated depreciation and impairment loss. right? So for this account we are crediting that 100,000 or 0.1 million. Therefore the balance of this account at the reporting date would be here 0.7 million. right? So that is how we account for impairment loss. Right. So now there's an activity. See whether you can do this. The cost and accumulated depreciation of a plant as at 31st March 2021 were rupees 5 million and rupees 1.5 million respectively. The fair value less cost of disposal and value in use of this plant on this date was 3.2 million and 3.3 million respectively. So you need to calculate the recoverable amount, you need to identify the impairment loss, and you need to provide the journal entries and the extracts of the financial statement. I will give you 3 minutes. Please attempt this one. Right. So in activity 1, these informations have been provided. Cost, accumulated depreciation, fair value less cost to sell, and value in use. The first thing we need to calculate is the recoverable amount. Recoverable amount is what? The recoverable amount is the higher of fair value less cost to sell and value in use. මේ figures දෙකෙන් මොනා ගියද? වඩා වැඩියා ගිය. Therefore, what should be our recoverable amount? What should be our recoverable amount? Chaturika, what should be the recoverable amount? What is the recoverable amount? Doctor කෙනෙක්ට patient ගෙන් ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහලා patient උත්තර නොදී හිටියොත් doctorට කොච්චර වෙලාවක් තියෙනවද ඊළඟ ප්‍රශ්නෙට යන්න? Doctor කෙනෙක් patient ගෙන් ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහලා patient උත්තරයක් නොදී හිටියොත් doctorට ඊළඟ ප්‍රශ්නේ අහන්න කොච්චර වෙලාවක් තියෙනවද? Right. මට එච්චර වෙලාවක් ඉන්න ඕනේ නැහැ උත්තරේ හම්බුණා. Right. Yes. That is 3.3. Whichever the higher. Right. 3.3 million. Then we need to determine the impairment loss. Right. Impairment loss equals to what? Now formula එකකට දැම්මොත් කොහමද? Carrying amount minus recoverable amount. So how can we calculate this? What is the carrying amount? Carrying amount එක කීයද? Cost minus accumulated depreciation. 5 minus 1.5, right? 3.5 million. And the recoverable amount in part 1 we have found it is 3.3. Therefore, impairment loss is how much? Impairment loss is here 0.2 million, right? The difference. And we need to pass the journal entry for the impairment loss. What to debit and what to credit? PNL debit, right? PNL debit. හරිනම් accumulated depreciation and impairment loss කියලා account එකකට credit කරන්න ඕන, but right, for ease use I will credit it to asset account. But you know, right, where it will last pitch accumulated depreciation දැම්මත් එයා අන්තිමට ගිහිල්ලා නතර වෙන්නේ උතන, right? $0.2 million, right? This is the journal entry we need to pass. Extracts of the financial statements, so you can have a P&L, and under expenses you can show what? Impairment loss worth of 0.2, and you can have your balance sheet, and there under the assets you can show how much? Not 3.5, you need to show which figure? 3.3, right? So those are the extracts, right? So that is on activity 1. Activity 2 is up to you. You can do at your homes, right? And if there is an issue, you can contact me. So activity 2 is for you to do at home. Then about cash generating units. So far we have discussed about the individual assets, but we need to take into account the cash generating units as well, right? So here our focus has been on individual assets. So far we have discussed on how to do the impairment testing for individual assets, where both the fair value less cost to sell and value in use could be measured. අපිට මොකක් හරි individual asset එකක fair value less cost to sell එකත් measure කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් value in use එකත් measure කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් we have no issue, we can compute the recoverable amount, right? So here what it says, fair value less cost to sell can be determined for most assets, but many individual assets do not generate cash inflows in their own right. For an example, a machine in a factory works in conjunction with the rest of the assets in the factory. Recoverable amount එක determine කරන්න නම් we should know the fair value less cost to sell amount as well as the value in use amount. For most of the assets, we can identify the fair value less cost to sell, no issue. But when it comes to consider the value in use, when it comes to determining or computing the value in use, we may have issues with regards to individual assets. Value in use එක කැල් කරන්න මොකද්ද වෙන්න ඕන? අදාළ asset එක මොකක් කරන්න ඕනද? cash flows generate කරන්න ඕන. That is present value of future cash flows නේ. You know, value in use කැල් කරන්න නම් මොකක්ද? ඒක අදාළ asset එක cash flows generate කරන්න ඕන. In practically what happens? තනි machine එකට පුළුවන්ද ගොඩක් වෙලාවට තනි asset එකට පුළුවන්ද cash flows generate කරන්න? ගොඩක් වෙලාවට බෑ. Right? මොකක් හරි unit එකක් තමයි cash flows generate කරන්නේ. Right? Therefore, for individual assets, most of the time we may not able to identify exactly their cash inflows and outflows. So that is where we need to deal with cash generating units. Right? Cash generating unit is a combination of individual assets, right? Which will result in cash flows, which we can determine the cash inflows and outflows. So when it is not possible to determine the recoverable amount, value in use එක කැල් කරන්න බැරි නම් අපිට individual asset එකට අදාළ recoverable amount එක determine කරගන්න බෑ. For an individual asset, then what we should do is we need to determine the recoverable amount of the cash generating unit to which the asset belongs. තනි asset එකක් විදියට නෙවෙයි නම් මොකක් හරි unit එකක් විදියට නම් එතනින් cash flows generate වෙන්නේ. So we need to consider that cash generating unit instead of the individual asset. The impairment test is applied to the cash generating unit. This unit we consider as a one, right, item, not the individual asset. So the impairment testing also need to be done for the whole cash generating unit. Machines තුනක් එකතු වෙලා නම් මොකක් හරි product එකක් එළියට දෙන්නේ. අපි තනි machine එකට අදාළ impairment testing කරන්න බෑ. අපිට මොකද කරන්න වෙන්නේ? Machine තුනම එකට අරගෙන එකට ගත්තට පස්සේ තමයි අපි කියන්නේ මොකද්ද? Cash generating unit එකක් කියලා. එහෙනම් මේ cash generating unit එක impair වෙලාද නැද්ද කියලා තමයි අපි test කරන්න වෙන්නේ. Right? So here we have given the definition of a cash generating unit. Is the smallest identifiable group of assets that generates cash flows that are largely independent of the cash inflows from other assets or group of assets. That is the smallest identifiable group of assets. Right? අපිට machines A, B, C, D, E, F පහම එකතු වෙලා cash flows generate කරන්නත් පුළුවන්. හැබැයි A, B, C ට cash flows ඒ තුන් දෙනා විතරක් එකතු වෙලා generate කරන්න පුළුවන්. Now cash generating unit identify කරද්දී, right, we should be careful to determine the smallest identifiable group of assets which generate cash flows. Cash flows generate කරන්න පුළුවන් කුඩාම unit එකක් තමයි cash generate unit කියලා කියන්නේ. So how to determine, that is up to the management, right? That is management judgment. Right. An impairment loss arises when the carrying amount of the cash generating unit. දැන් අපි individual asset නෙමෙයි අර asset ටික ඔක්කොම එකතු කරලා එකක් කියලා consider කරන්න. So the impairment loss arises when the carrying amount of the cash generating unit of those assets is greater than the recoverable amount. නම් අර machines තුනේම carrying amount එකට වඩා ඒ machines තුනෙන් recoverable amount එක අඩුයි නම් then only we identify the impairment loss. Right? Principles for determining recoverable amount are the same for cash generating units as for most individual assets. Principle එක එකයි. Carrying amount එකට වඩා recoverable amount එක වැඩි නම් then we need to identify the impairment loss. That is the principle. Right? Accounting for the impairment loss, the loss is allocated to each asset in the cash generating unit on a pro rata basis. If we have identified maybe say 5,000 impairment loss, that 5,000, so our cash generating unit is consisting with 3 machines. So that we have identified an impairment loss of 5,000. This 5,000 we need to allocate among these 3 machines, right, on a pro rata basis. How to do that we will discuss with an example. Losses are accounted for in the same way as for individual assets discussed earlier, right? So nothing differs from its principle. The carrying amount of an asset cannot be reduced below the highest of fair value less cost to sell if determinable, value in use if determinable, or 0. Right? That one also I will discuss with an example. මේ අන්තිම පොයින්ට් එක කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියලාත් මම example එකකින් කතා කරන්න. Right. Here we have an activity number 3. Right? A Limited has identified an impairment loss of this much, 12,000, on one of its cash generating units. Cash generating unit එකේ ඔන්න impairment loss එක අඳුනගෙන කැල් කරලා අපිට ගාණ දෙනවා 12,000. The cash generating unit consists of the following assets stated at current carrying amounts. Right? Cash generating මේ කියන cash generating unit එකේ මෙන්න මේ assets ටික තමයි තියෙන්නේ. කියන්නේ මෙන්න මේ assets ටික එකතු වෙලා තමයි අපිට cash flows generate කරලා දෙන්නේ. Right? Building, equipment, land and fittings. And further they says the fair value less cost to sell of the building is 497,000. I told you for most of the individual assets we may able to calculate the fair value less cost to sell, but not value in use. That is why we are dealing with cash generating units. Right? Here they have specifically given the fair value less cost to sell of the building is this much, 497,000. We need to calculate the allocation of impairment loss against all assets in the cash generating unit. Right? එහෙනම් මෙන්න මේ 12,000 මෙන්න මේ assets හතරේ කොහොමද අපි allocate කරන්නේ කියන එක තමයි අහන්නේ. Right? That is what we need to find. Activity 3. We have 4 assets: buildings, equipment, land and fittings. Here we have the carrying amounts: 500,000, 300,000, 250,000 and 150,000. Right. And we need to allocate the impairment loss. Therefore, balance we should show in the financial should be after this deduction. Right. 12,000. So how much is the total of the carrying amount of this cash generating unit? Me cash generating unit එකේ total carrying amount එක කීයද? 1.2 million or 1,200. Right? 1,000 something කළා කියන 1,200. Right. So we have identified an impairment loss of 12,000. Right. This is the amount of the impairment loss we have identified. So we need to allocate this impairment loss among these four assets on the pro rata basis. Right. Pro rata basis. Pro rata basis here out of 1.2 million, right? 0.5 million is belonging to what? 0.5 million is belonging to building, right? මේ ratio එක ගත්ත විදිහ තේරෙනව නේද? ඔක්කොම assets වල carrying amount එක 1.2 million නැත්නම් 1200. ඒ 1200 වලින් 500 ම කාගේද? building වල. එහෙනම් එතනට අදාළ ratio එක කීයද? 0.42. Then here out of this 12,000, right, this much should be allocated to buildings. එනම් impairment loss මේ අඳුනගත්ත 12000න් 5000ක්ම assign වෙන්න ඕන කාටද? buildings වලට. But we have a restriction. What? The fair value less cost to sell of the building is 497,000. ඒ කියන්නේ මෙන්න මෙතන balance එක, right, මීට වඩා අඩු වෙන්න බෑ. අපි මේ impairment loss එක අයින් කරති මෙතනට කීයක් එනවද? 500,000 minus this 5,000, it will be 495,000. But we have determined that fair value less cost to sell of the building is this much, right? So this value cannot be go lower than this amount. මේ value එකට වඩා අඩු වෙන්න බෑ. එහෙනම් අපිට 5000ම අඩු කරන්න බෑ pro rata basis එකකින් එන. What is the maximum amount we can reduce here? Allocate here. That is 3,000. Right? Only we can allocate 3,000. Therefore, this ratio is not applicable for buildings. Clear? Pro rata basis එකෙන් ගත්ත pro rata basis එකෙන් ගත්ත තින් 5000ක් එනවා. 5000ක් ආවති මෙන්න මේ value එකට වඩා අඩු value එකක් එන්නේ. Right? So therefore we cannot go beyond or we cannot go lower than this value. Therefore, the maximum allocation we can make is 3,000 with respect to buildings. Now, out of this 12,000, we have allocated 3,000 for building. Impairment of building. What is the remaining amount? තව කීයක් allocate කරන්න ඕනද? We further need to allocate 9,000. ඒ 9,000 allocate වෙන්න ඕන කවුරු මොන assets වලට අදාළවද? මෙන්න මේ assets තුනට අදාළ. Right. So now how we can determine these pro ratas or these ratios? Here, what? Now the total carrying amount of the remaining asset is this much, 700,000, right? Out of this 700,000, 300,000 belongs to what? Equipment. Therefore, the ratio applicable there is what? 0.43. Minimum remaining asset තුනේම carrying amount එක 700,000. Out of that, 300,000 belongs to equipment. Right? Here is also the same. Right? Here, 150,000 out of 700,000. Right? This is how we determine the ratios. Now, the amount that we should allocate as impairment loss, how can we determine that? Out of this 9,000, right, 0.43 belongs to equipment. Out of this 9,000 remaining impairment loss, this much belongs to land. Out of this 9,000, 0.21%, right, 21% belongs to fittings. Now, you can see we have allocated the total amount of 12,000 impairment loss among the 4 assets, right? So the balance that we will show under each of these assets would be these amounts, right? So this is how we do with respect to a cash generating unit, right? Cash generating unit එකට අදාළව අපි ওই විදියට තමයි impairment loss එක allocate වෙන්නේ. Right? This calculation part is similar. Here is the carrying amount and we compare it with the recoverable amount. If we found that the carrying amount is greater than the recoverable amount, then we need to identify the impairment loss. The allocation part is the new thing we need to learn here. Right? Allocate කරන්නේ කොහොමද කියන එක තමයි මෙතනදී අපිට ඉගෙන ගන්න තියෙන්නේ. අනිත් ඒවා individual asset එකේ අපි කරන විදියම තමයි. Right. That is activity 3. So I will upload these answers to your Google Classroom. So what if our cash generating unit consists of goodwill? Goodwill එකක් තිබ්බොතින් මොකද කරන්නේ? Right? The asset goodwill can only arise in a business combination. You know these things. It cannot be internally generated, revalued or amortized. It is subject to impairment testing. Earlier we discussed, right? Goodwill generated through business combination should be tested for impairment annually, irrespective of whether there are impairment indications or not. Right? So goodwill is a residual balance consisting of assets that cannot be individually identified or separately recognized. Therefore, it is not possible to determine fair value less cost for goodwill or to identify cash flows relating specifically to goodwill. When goodwill is recognized in a business combination, it must be allocated to one or more cash generating units. Assume we have 5 cash generating units in our business. අපි අර වගේ වෙන වෙනම individually cash generate කරන්න පුළුවන් units 5ක් අඳුනගෙන තියෙනවා. And due to business combination, we have generated a goodwill as well. That particular goodwill amount we need to allocate among these 5 cash generating units. එතකොට එක cash generating unit එක goodwill එකක් තිබුණා කියලා එකෙන් අදහස් වෙන්නේ මේ company සම්පූර්ණ goodwill එක කියන එක. Goodwill එක අර cash generating units අතර බෙදිලා යනවා. LKAS 36 requires that goodwill be allocated to the lowest value at which management monitors the goodwill. Right. And goodwill can only be tested for impairment at the cash generating unit level. Individual assets වලට මේක අදාළ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. Right. So the principle here is also the same, and we will discuss that point with this activity. Right. This should be activity number 4. Okay, activity 3 නෙමෙයි, this should be activity 4. Right, this one. Activity 4. When our cash generating unit has a goodwill, what can we do? How can we allocate the impairment loss? A Limited has identified an impairment loss of this much, 300,000, on one of its cash generating unit. The cash generating unit consists of the following assets, right? Buildings, equipment, land, and goodwill. See, now in our cash generating unit, there is goodwill as well. අපේ cash generating unit එකේ goodwill කියන component එකක් තියෙනවා. කලින් example එකේ තිබ්බේ නැහැ. So here also we need to calculate the allocation of the impairment loss. The assets here we have is buildings, equipment, land, and goodwill. Right? We have given the carrying amounts 500,000, 300,000, 200,000, 150,000. Right? We see ratio and we need to identify the impairment loss allocation, and then we can have the balance amount. Here the impairment loss we have identified is how much? 300,000. So here now what is the special case here? මේගානේ කලින්කත් එක්ක සාපේක්ෂව special component එක මොකද්ද? Here we have a goodwill balance of 150,000. So if we are going to do the impairment allocation for a cash generating unit consist with a goodwill component, first what we need to do is we need to allocate the impairment loss for what? For goodwill in the full amount, right? මෙතන impairment loss එක තිබ්බනම් 300,000 නෙවෙයි 100,000 කියලා. අපි අපේ goodwill value එක තියෙනවා 150,000. එහෙනම් මේ 100,000 ම අපිට මෙතන allocate කරන්න පුළුවන්. Right? So here the impairment loss amount is greater than the goodwill amount. Therefore, what here we do is we allocate the total amount of 150,000 goodwill කියලා account goodwill allocation එක මෙතනට ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන මේ 150,000 ම, right? We allocate for impairment loss. Then it means what? Balance එකක් විදිහට අපිට කීයක්වත් ඉතුරු වෙනවද? මේ cash generating unit එකේ goodwill කියලා? No. The balance will be nil, zero. That is the first thing we need to do when there is a goodwill in our cash generating unit. Goodwill component එකක් තියෙනවා නම් ඉස්සෙල්ලම අපි allocate කරන්නේ goodwill එකට. Now, therefore, we have allocated for the goodwill 150,000. It means the remaining amount of the impairment loss is 150,000. Now this 100 and the remaining of 150,000 we need to allocate among these three assets on the pro rata basis. Right? මෙතන කොහොමද වෙන්නේ? 500,000 out of කීයද? මේ තුනේම asset වල එකතුව කීයද? carrying amount වල එකතුව කීයද? 100,000. Right? Here 300 over 1,000. Here 200 over 1,000. Right? So now we can allocate the impairment. Out of this remaining 150,000, 0.5 belongs to building. Out of this 150,000, 0.3 belongs to equipment. Out of this 150,000, 0.2 or 20% should be belongs to land. Therefore, the total 300,000 of impairment loss we have allocated among these four assets. Right? The balance amount after deducting these impairment loss, right, is this much. Clear? Only the difference is on here, goodwill. We need to fully allocate that one, right? Clear? Activity 3 and activity 4. Right? Then reversal of an impairment loss. This is the last part of today's session. Reversal. Right? Reversal of an impairment loss. Recognized losses are reassessed annually. Right? If we have done an impairment test and if we have found an impairment loss with respect to a particular asset, then we need to be more careful. අපි මොකක් හරි කලින් අවුරුද්දක impairment test එකක් කරලා impairment loss එකක් අඳුනගෙන තියෙනවා නම් මොකක් හරි asset එකකට අදාළව, then there we need to be more careful. Why? Then annually or at the reporting date of the subsequent years, we need to assess, we need to reassess, right, whether those indications are still exist. or whether those indications have what we say, whether those indications still exist or whether they have improved, right? That one we need to assess, or whether there's a reversal of this loss that we have identified. අපි impairment loss එකක් අඳුන ගන්න වෙන්නේ ඇයි? අපිට impairment test එකක් කරන්න වෙන්නේ ඇයි? impairment indications තියෙද්දි. දැන් මාකට් එකේ interest rates අඩු වුණා. ඒ indication එක නිසා තමයි impairment test එක කරේ. impairment test එක කරපු නිසා තමයි impairment loss එකක් අඳුනගත්තේ. එහෙම අඳුනගත්තට පස්සේ ඔය condition එක වෙනස් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. interest rate වැඩි වෙච්ච නිසානේ interest rate මෙන්න ඊළඟ අවුරුදු වල අපිට නැත්නම් අපි reporting date එක වෙද්දී අඩු වෙලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. අර අඳුනගත්ත impairment indication එක improve වෙලා. ඒක හොඳ අතට හැරිලා. එතකොට මොකද්ද? අර loss එක අපිට reverse කරන්න පුළුවන් හැකියාවක් තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. Right? So like that way, if we have identified an impairment loss previously, then we need to keep on looking whether those indications have been improved or whether those indications are still exist, whether they have not exist at the moment, right? Here what it says, are there indicators the previous loss does not exist or has decreased? Indicators are the same as those used for initially recognizing a loss. It's the same indications we are referring, external and internal. A review of the indicators might result in changes to depreciation parameters, right? And if there is a change in the estimate, the reversal of impairment is possible. Ability to recognize a reversal of an impairment loss and the accounting for that reversal is dependent on whether the reversal relates to individual asset, cash generating unit or goodwill, right? So here, previously recognized impairment losses in relation to individual assets are able to reverse up to the recoverable amount. So there is a limitation, right? And the double entry is given. So I will take up this with an example. Assume, right? So the carrying amount of an asset is 1,000. I'm taking the same example I have taken initially, right? The carrying amount which shows in the books of account is 1,000. And then we have calculated the recoverable amount and found the value, the recoverable amount is 800,000. Right? Assume this particular asset we have bought for 2,000 rupees and the useful life is 10 years. දෙදාහකට ගත්ත මැෂින් එකක් අවුරුදු 10ක useful life එකක් තිබ්බ asset එකක්, right? අවුරුදු 5ක් ගියාට පස්සේ තත්ත්වය තමයි මේ. 5ක් ගියාට පස්සේ හරිනේ අවුරුදු 5ට 1000ක් depreciate වෙලා. So the carrying amount 2000 minus 1000, the carrying amount is 1000. And after the end of the 5th year, we have computed the recoverable amount, that is 800. So we cannot take this amount into our balance sheet. The amount we need to consider is this 800,000, right? That is the identification of the impairment loss, right? Then we come to the following year. ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දට එනවා, right? ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දට ආවට පස්සේ, so what is the carrying amount now we show in our balance sheet? දැන් අපි පෙන්නන carrying amount එක කීයද balance sheet එකේ? What is the carrying amount we can show in our balance sheet? What? තව අවුරුදු කීයක් තියෙනවද? මේ recoverable amount එක කැල්කලා මේක පොත්වලට අරන් ආවට පස්සේ තව අවුරුදු කීයක් අපිට මේ asset එක පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්ද? What is the remaining useful life? For how many years we can use this asset further? අවුරුදු 5කට පස්සේ තමයි මේ value එක ආවේ. ඒ කියන්නේ තව අවුරුදු කීයක් පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන්ද? 5ක්. එහෙනම් what should be the carrying amount in the following year? ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දේ carrying amount එක වෙන්නේ කීයද? අපි මේ 1000 පහෙන් බෙදන්නේ or we are dividing this 800 by 5 800 over 5 what මේක මම කලින් කිව්වා තව අවුරුදු 5ක් තියෙනවා right අපි මේ 1000ද ඊළඟ අවුරුද්ද depreciation අඳුන ගනිද්දී අපි අඳුන ගන්න ඕන 200ද නැත්නම් 160ද what should be the depreciation amount for the following year is it 200 or is it should be 160 what it should be kiyada 160 right 160 800 tamai over its useful life allocate when known it means for the following year we need to identify depreciation worth of 160 එතකොට අපි carrying amount කියලා පොත්වල පෙන්නන්නේ කීයද 800 minus 160 that is 640 640 right අපි loss එකක් අඳුනගෙන තිබ්බ කීයකද 200ක loss එකක් අඳුනගෙන තිබ්බා right now this is what it is reflected in our balance sheet 640 and for the following year also we need to calculate the recoverable amount right we need to calculate the recoverable amount now assume the recoverable amount on this reporting date is 900 then recoverable amount එක මේ same asset එකට මේ asset එකේ අපි impairment loss එකක් අඳුනගෙන තියෙන්නේ ඊට පස්සේ අවුරුද්දේ බලද්දි පොත්වල පෙන්නනවා carrying amount කියලා 640 and we have assessed the recoverable amount and we found it is 900 now what we should do can we reverse this 200 අපිට මෙන්න මේ කලින් අඳුනගත්ත loss එක මේක right if we found this in the first case what will we do we will do nothing right we will not take any further action but since we have recognized a loss previously and then in the subsequent year we found the recoverable amount has increased and it is greater than our carrying amount now we are in a position to reverse the loss we have identified previously right අපිට මේ අඳුනගත්ත loss එක reverse කරන්න පුළුවන් situation එකකට අපි දැන් ඇවිල්ලා ඉන්නේ right reverse කරන්න පුළුවන් කියලා අපිට මොකක් reverse කරන්න බැරිද අපි අඳුනගත්ත loss එකට වඩා වැඩි amount එකක් අපිට reverse කරන්න බෑ right මේ දෙකේ difference එක තියෙනවා කීයක්ද 260 difference is there but we cannot charge 260 to our or we cannot take 260 to our PNL right impairment loss reversal කියලා මෙතන 260 මාරන් එන්න බෑ why we have identified a loss of 200 only therefore that is the maximum amount we can credit to our PNL right and when determining that we should consider if we have not identified an impairment loss what would be the carrying amount අපි මේ impairment loss එක අඳුනගත්තේ නැත්තම් මෙතන මෙහෙම recoverable amount එකක් අපි කැල් කරලා loss එකක් අඳුනගත්තේ නැත්තම් මෙන්න මෙදා වෙද්දී අපේ පොත්වල පෙන්නන carrying amount එක කීයක් වෙයිද 1000 over 5 එහෙනම් ඊළඟ අවුරුද්දේ තව 200ක් depreciate වෙලා 800ක් පෙන්නයි right okay so when right so for the ease of use we will say this is right asset account right we are debiting to the asset account කීයද මේ දැන් අපි debit කරන්න යන්නේ අපි impairment loss 200ක් අඳුනගත්තා මේක improve වෙච්ච නිසා 260ක් වෙනකන් යන්න පුළුවන් හැබැයි we have a restriction because we have previously identified 200 we can take 200 only to our P&L. Therefore, we will debit 200 to our asset. Now what happens when we pass in this entry? අපි මෙන්න මේ entry pass කරාට පස්සේ මොකක් වෙයිද? අපි balance sheet එකේ පෙන්නන asset value එක කීයක් වෙයිද? දැනට අපේ පොත්වල පෙන්නනවා 640ක්. මේ entry pass කරති මේ reversal entry pass කරතින් අපි කීයක් පෙන්නනවද? Clear? Since the situation has improved, since the impairment indications that led to the impairment loss is not available now, not exist now, we found our recoverable amount is greater than the carrying amount for the same asset where we identified an impairment loss. So now we are in a position to reverse that impairment loss, which we have identified 200. Right? If we fully reverse the impairment loss we identified, what is the amount that we will reflect in our balance sheet? මේ reversal එක කරාට පස්සේ balance sheet එකේ assets කියලා කීයක් අපි පෙන්නාවිද? කීයක් පෙන්නයිද? මෙන්න මෙතන balance sheet එකේ කීයක් පෙන්නයිද? මෙන්න මේ අවුරුද්දට අදාළව reporting date එකේදී 640 තිබ්බේ මෙයත් debit කරොතින් කීයක් යා වෙනවද? 840 වෙනවා. Right? It will become 840. But again, there is a restriction. What? Carrying amount that would have been determined had no impairment loss been previously recognized. Right? The new carrying amount, this is the new carrying amount, cannot be higher than the carrying amount that would have been determined had no impairment loss been recognized previously. මෙන්න මෙතන මේ impairment loss එක අපි අඳුනගත්තේ නැත්නම් මේ අවුරුද්දේ reporting date එක වෙද්දී අපි කීයක් පෙන්නනවද? We may show 800 as the carrying amount. But the new carrying amount here, if we reverse this loss completely, is how much? 840. Therefore, we cannot totally reverse this 200. The amount, therefore, we can reverse is how much? අපිට උපරිම reverse කරන්න පුළුවන් කීයක් විතරද? 160. Right? This is the maximum amount we can reverse. This loss එක සම්පූර්ණ reverse කරාට පස්සේ එන අලුත් carrying amount එක. මේකනේ අලුත් carrying amount එක. අපි මෙහෙම loss එකක් අඳුනගත්තේ නැතුව එන carrying amount එකට වඩා වැඩි වෙන්න බෑ. කියන්නේ මේ 800 වලට වඩා වැඩි වෙන්න බෑ. Right? Therefore, the maximum amount that we can reverse is not 200, not this 200, but what? 160. Right? That is what the standard required. The requirement of the standard. Right? Hope it is clear. And disclosures. So this is linked with the assignment which I have given to you. So when you are doing the assignment, you will come across, right? What are the disclosure requirements coming under LKAS 36? So that is up to you. Right? So that is the end of today's session. Right? And so here, right? So this is actually something that you should done, right? You should do, but I have prepared this for my reference. Right here, you can see LKAS 36, the standard we discussed today. Right? It has been frequently tested in your past papers. In 2019 also, as I can remember, for 6 marks, this has been tested. Right? So you better, right, take down these questions. So 2015, it is question number 1, part 6. 2016, it is question number 1, part 5. In 2017, there are two parts, question number 1, part 4 and 5, 2018, part 5. In 2019 also, it is in question number 1. It was in question number 1, part 5 or 6, the last part. Right? So you can attempt these questions related with the LKAS 36 standard. Right? May past papers will answer karanna. If you have any doubts, if you need to clarify anything, right, in providing answers for these, I can help. Clear?